Angels Care Home Health, serving Hayes and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
I love the nurses that come and see me.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible.
Since I've learned about Angel Care, I would recommend them to anybody.
Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.
Eagle Community Television presents Community Connection with your host, Mike Cooper.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for watching Eagle Community Television and our Community Connection. And thanks to the producer and editor of our series, Jeff Durall, and on camera too from Eagle Community Television, Brandon Cooley. We're at Albertson Hall, third floor, with Mark Eberle, teacher of biology at Fort Hays State University, and author, now author of Kansas Baseball, 1858 to 1941, available at the University Press of Kansas. The book came out in April. We wanted to follow up with Mark. Mark Eberle teaches in the Department of Biological Sciences at Fort Hays State, co-author of Kansas Fishes and Fishes of the Central United States, second edition, both published by the University of Press of Kansas. Baseball and biology, they don't seem to mix, Mark.
Well, in some ways, I guess it does a little bit. Doing fish books before this, that's something we associate with the summer. And baseball is something that we associate with summer too, both things we associate with growing up and those sorts of things. So I guess maybe there's some connection there. But
why baseball, though?
Just one of those things that kind of you grow up with, you kind of have a long-term interest in it. And I just kind of started doing this by accident. It was because of Larks Park here in Hays. There's a sign on there that says constructed by the WPA in the city of Hays in 1940. And so I was just curious about who else might have had those, and I was just playing around with it, and people kept asking me questions as I asked them questions, and so it just kind of grew by accident.
Did you play baseball?
Informally. 1 year of Little League, but that was it. So the rest of the time it was mostly watching, collecting baseball cards, all those things that boys do when they're growing up in Kansas City.
More of a fan?
Yeah, more of a fan.
Kansas City, obviously.
Kansas City A's at that time. Yeah, it's been a few years.
Are you team Royals now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
don't root for the A's.
What's wrong with the Royals?
I don't know. I think they've forgotten how to be boys again. So yeah, is what it is. Yeah. But yeah, they've grown up. So
I've heard that you get so involved in the pressure that you forget it's supposed to be fun and go out and have fun and you'll win games.
And they seem to be doing that a little bit more now. So we'll hope for the best. Hope springs eternal in baseball.
Well, you say you had a lot of questions about different things of interest in baseball. How'd the book come about?
Well, mostly I was looking to just see what other old ballparks there were in the state. Didn't realize how many there were and didn't have any real good idea. So I started looking around to find those. And then if you kind of start looking at the story behind those ballparks, the ballpark is something we can still physically experience. You can go to a baseball game there. But it's the baseball players, the people that built them, and those kinds of things are the really essential backstory to those ballparks. And so I just kind of started looking a little bit more, into that history that went along with those, and there were some interesting stories there, some of which made me kind of go, is that real? Baseball's full of its myths, like fishing, and so I kind of started just digging a little bit more, and it just kind of, it grew by accident into a manuscript.
And the manuscript time frame, when did it kind of begin?
So about 3 years. So about the time Kansas Fishes ended, I was just kind of playing around with this because all that time I'd spent working on that book, I felt like I had nothing to do in the evenings, and so I thought, well, I'll look at something else, and that's what happened.
Kansas Baseball, 1858 to 1941, with the author Mark Eberle from Fort Hays State University. Long history in Kansas of baseball?
Yeah, basically it matches the state's history. The first references to baseball games were in the 1850s, late 1850s, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but nothing organized, just people out playing when they could, dodging bullets and whatever else they might have been doing at that time. And it was after the Civil War that organized baseball really kind of started to come into Kansas. And it was when baseball really kind of took off in a lot of places. I mean, its early beginnings were shortly before the Civil War, so it became much more organized after the war everywhere. So it kind of fits Kansas history quite a bit.
What about the years 1858 to 1941? How was that chosen, Mark?
1858, just because that was the first reference we've been able to find of a baseball game of any kind in the state. And then 1941 is the beginning of the Second World War for us. Of course, it began in 1939, but for the U.S. it began 2 years later. And a lot of things started to change after that experience. Segregation, a lot of those things, women in the workplace, a lot of those attitudes began to change after that, and baseball began to change. After the Second World War, Jackie Robinson got his start, with the Dodgers. And it took a long time, but little by little, baseball became a more inclusive sort of a sport, whereas before that it had been very much segregated by race and by gender.
Did you find that baseball kind of mirrored the changes in society, Mark?
In a lot of ways it did, and Kansas was in kind of a unique position because we've never had a major league team. Technically the Royals, the A's, all the Monarchs, all those teams were in Missouri because they were on the other side of the border. And so Kansas never had that major league team, some minor league teams. And so it was all really about local baseball. And so when you get that local baseball aspect going, it tends to reflect community attitudes and a lot of those sorts of things. But it's the explanations aren't always so simple. It's not like you can say it was always this way. There are always those exceptions that occurred.
Fair to say, Mark, that baseball is ingrained in most of us in some form, whether you played on the neighborhood team or just out in the street with a ball and bat?
It seems to be one of those things, I think partly because it's the summer sport, and that's when you're growing up, when do you have free time to go run around is during the summer, and so you've got more time to go do that sort of a thing. So at least it always has been. Whether it still is or not, I don't know. But it certainly is still a very popular sport at the major league level. There are a lot of town teams that are still playing in other states. We have collegiate league teams in Kansas, so it's still there. So there's still kind of an undercurrent of support for that sort of a thing, because it's something you can do. It's leisurely, and you can do it. It's every night almost, and so you can pick your nights that you go watch a baseball game. So it's kind of a nice summer relaxation.
And that point you made about the leisurely pace of it is both a plus and minus to some people with baseball, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, because but even if you look at things like football and how much time, they're only actually playing for an hour. But that game on TV lasts much longer than an hour because there are all those times in between plays and the timeouts and all those sorts of things. There's just a lot of frenzied activity at one time. In baseball, there's not quite as much frenzy perhaps, so maybe it seems different. But golf, all those sorts of sports that we watch on TV are all really kind of the same thing in a general sense.
So Mark, when you started researching the book, where'd you find the information?
Some of it came from museum archives, just visiting with folks at them, and they could tell me stories, and then I could go do some more digging. But most of it is documented in Kansas newspapers. A lot of them are available online now. The State Historical Society has been doing a very good job of adding, and they still are, adding more and more newspapers online so you can access them that way, and they're searchable, which helps a lot. You can punch in a keyword and things pop up most of the time. Some of the old newsprints not so clear, and so mostly it's based on Kansas newspapers. So either online or going to the State Historical Society and looking at lots of microfilm.
What about in your research, Mark, some of the highlights you found?
Well, some of the history is a little more varied than I thought it was going to be, and it was kind of a surprise to learn that the organized baseball took over after the Civil War, and most of those were teams of white males. But at the same time, there were also teams being organized of African American men, and there were teams being organized of women. And so all of that was out there, and nobody's really looked at that in Kansas before. Everything that's been printed before about the general history of baseball in Kansas has kind of focused on those town teams, the white male teams in those early years. And so I didn't realize how much variety there was and how many people put any kind of a category on people you want to, and they were playing baseball.
And you can find those individual chapters in the book, Kansas Baseball 1858 to 1941, with author Mark Eberle from Fort Hays State University. It's available, by the way, on Amazon. You can get the hard copy, you can get a paperback version now, and it's even available on Kindle now, which is the way I'm going to go for it, I think. But the last we checked, there were only 15 copies left, so you better research early and hurry. But locally in Hayes, there are also some options, right?
Yeah, so far I know the Sternberg Museum gift shop has picked up some copies and has them in stock now. And there are some other places that are looking into it. The Historical Society and some others are looking into carrying it as well. Don't have Hastings anymore, but there are still some places that sell books in town.
Public Library
Public
has one,
Library will
or
have one. The Fort Hays Library has a copy that can be checked out.
Forsyth has one then.
Yes.
Okay, all right. But do research that book with Mark. Let me tell you a little bit about the review, which I found fascinating. Mark Eberle's Kansas Baseball, 1858 to 1941, is a valuable study of the underappreciated role of baseball as a mirror of social, cultural, and economic influences. You touched on that a bit. In the state, as it navigated its formative years. His examination of teams of immigrants, women, African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans is a treat and reveals much about Kansas society and character during the period prior to World War II. The author's impressive use of local and regional newspapers, county and city archives, and recent websites had produced a model that will not be duplicated. It will be a wonderful book to take on a road trip across Kansas to explore its past. And this from John Dreyfert, editor of Baseball History from Outside the Lines, a reader. That's a nice testimony.
He's at Wichita State University.
Is he?
Yeah.
Ah, a nice testimony to your work, Mark. Okay, we got to talk about the uniform now.
Okay.
Give me the background on the uniform, WBKSNS.
So doing all of this, of course, and being in Hayes and looking at Larks Park, Fort Hays having sports teams from the beginning, a little over 100 years ago now, found some old photos of the first baseball teams that played here. It wasn't called Fort Hays State University back then, so that's why all the initials on the shirt. So it was a branch of the normal school, the Teachers College in Emporia, and so western branch of the Kansas State Normal School, so they had to abbreviate it, too many letters to write it all out. So this, we did the best we could, black and white photos, but the newspapers described the original school colors as royal blue and gold. And so found a color that looks royal blue and had one manufactured. So at the moment, it's the only one of its kind.
And the fabric?
It's all wool. It's a wool flannel.
And something that we normally didn't think of, Brandon and Jeff were commenting on this, that, you know, in the summertime, you think, wow, wearing wool, not a good idea.
But it was kind of the natural fabric to keep you cool. It gets wet, but it evaporates that water very quickly, and so it helps keep you cool. Most of the military uniforms that were used by the soldiers at the fort at the time that it was active were wearing blue wool uniforms. So.
Once again, the book is Kansas Baseball, 1858 to 1941, with author from the University Press of Kansas. Came out in April. Mark Eberle, teacher of biology at Fort Hays State. We get into some of the individual chapters as Mark's work reflects different varieties of baseball teams in the state. Our community connection from Eagle Community Television.
Angels Care Home Health, serving Hayes and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
I love the nurses that come and see me.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible.
Since I've learned about Angel Care, I would recommend them to anybody.
Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.
Our community connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks to Brandon Cooley and Jeff DeRaw, producer, editor, and camera for our series, as we visit with Mark Eberle, teacher of biology at Fort Hays State University. Not about biology this time, but about baseball. The book is Kansas Baseball. Here's your summer read, 1858 to 1941. Mark's book out now and available. The Hayes Public Library has it on order. The Forsyth Library on the campus has it, as well as, of course, available through Amazon in hardback, paperback, and also on Kindle. The book with a foreword by Dorothy Seymour Mills. Who's Dorothy Seymour Mills?
Dorothy Seymour Mills and her husband, the late Harold Seymour, wrote the first large 3-volume work on the history of baseball. It spread out over several years, and she was the primary author on the one that was subtitled The People's Game, which in a lot of ways mirrors what this is. It wasn't about the major leagues, it was about the town teams, the African American teams, the women's teams, and so on. And so she still goes to meetings. I saw her a couple of weeks ago actually, and so she still gets out and about. She's kind of the grand old lady of baseball history, and primarily as a historian as opposed to a baseball fan, but just one of the sweetest people you could meet.
Tell me about, before we get into the individual chapters, Mark, tell me about the University Press of Kansas and how it supports authors such as yourself.
Yeah, the University Press of Kansas is actually, a lot of people mistake that as being a University of Kansas entity. It is on their campus, but actually it represents all of the region's universities. And so all 6 of the universities, the provost appoints 2 people to represent their university to go to editorial board meetings and review any books that the editors there have recommended for publication. And so it's actually very inclusive of the entire state in terms of the region's system.
And you are one of those people that's on that board.
Got one more meeting left. It's a 2-year term, so I've got one more meeting in June, and then I'll be retired from that.
Now, the University Press of Kansas also published your Kansas Fishies. Right?
Yes, they did. And so they do a variety of local interest things. A lot of it's history and constitutional law kinds of things, but they do a lot of books. They've done books on the trails of Kansas, on the plants of Kansas, the birds of Kansas. So they do a lot of this stuff that represents what our universities are trying to do to educate
and many
people
of those
about the
authors right here at Fort Hays State University.
A lot of them are, yes, they are.
You divided the book into 2 parts, part 1 being the early history, town teams, and then we get into the individual leagues. Let's talk a little about those early histories and the town teams.
Okay. Yeah, the first chapter is primarily about the white male teams, what were usually referred to as town teams. And those were, the first one organized was in Leavenworth in December of 1865. They organized, the first games we see are in 1866, but they got organized that winter before. And other teams along the eastern border started to build, and then it gradually moved west. 1865, we were still at war with the American Indians out here, and so most of the teams were along that eastern border region, Fort Leavenworth, Fort Scott, and those areas, Lawrence, around there. And so they started playing the game. Some of them were former soldiers. Some of them were just immigrants from the Northeast, where baseball was already established in New England and New York, places like that. And so the game started to spread across the state, and at the same time the rules continued to change. Starting off you had to pitch underhand. You couldn't pitch overhand when they first started playing. And so the baseball was going through a lot of evolution as the state was going through an evolution, as it was finally filling out its borders in terms of the cities we know now. And so there are a lot of little interesting stories that go along with that. Some are true, some are not true. They're good stories, but they're not true.
Some of them in the book?
There are some in the book. So
tease us with one.
Well, the one, and I won't tell the answer, but there's one story that's been repeated several times, that Wild Bill Hickok was brought in to referee the third and deciding game between a team from Kansas City, the Kansas City Antelopes on the Missouri side, and a team from Atchison, Kansas, known as the Pomeroys. And so, but they'd had some fights, and so they figured they needed somebody who could make sure there was no fighting. And that supposedly occurred in 1866. So if you want to know the rest of that story, I'll just leave it at that.
And that's part of the town team. Were they individuals just from the community then? Were they?
Yeah, the club started off, basically they're sometimes referred to as gentlemen's clubs. Clubs in the truest sense, in that they had a president and a secretary, and they sent formal invitations to other teams to come play them, because travel was really difficult. In the 1860s, it was by horse and buggy or by train. And so it was a little bit more entailed to try and get these people together. And most people that were just, part of the regular workforce were working 6 days a week, often till early evening. They had very long work days. There wasn't a 40-hour work week then. And so it was the gentlemen, the people that had government office kind of jobs, owned businesses, or those sorts of things, they were the ones that were playing baseball. And so it was a different sport. They might play a game a week, and that would be really busy at the beginning. Sometimes it was maybe 1 or 2 a month that they would play because of the logistics of it all. And so they were really clubs, but very quickly it's transitioned over. It was transitioning across the country. It happened at the same time here, where teams sponsored by companies to improve employee morale and those sorts of things. And just regular workers would try and play. On Sundays was the only day they weren't working, but there was also a strong sentiment against doing anything on Sundays except going to church and sitting at home with your family. And there was actually a court case that's described in the book in some detail. And it was true of the nation. Major league teams, a lot of them didn't play on Sundays. Christy Mathewson wouldn't play on Sundays. And so it was a very strong sentiment, but that was the only day a lot of the people that worked 6 days a week could play games. And so there was a lot of arguing going back and forth about whether that was appropriate or not.
Were the rules kind of the same across the board for these teams, or did they kind of make them up depending on the town you were in?
They were, in large part. The nice thing happened right before the Civil War was that a set of printed rules became available out of New York, and so those rules then could be transported easily. A lot of the players picked it up from New England, as I mentioned, or they picked it up in military service. It's easy to carry a bat and a ball around on your horse or with your kit when you're a soldier, and so and you just play on an open field. And so the rules could get spread very easily that way, and so they could be reasonably consistent. But if you're playing on this wide variety of fields, from just a piece of pasture to a nice ballpark, there were all those ground rules and things. So there was some variation, and there still is today in some of those new stadiums. You have ground rules.
Let's get into some of the individual components, if you will. Women, African American, integrated and segregated. And one of your chapters on something that surprised me, American Indian persistent stereotypes. Talk about some of those.
Okay. African American teams formed about the same time as the teams of white males. The first game I was able to find was 1868, so only 2 years after the first games by organized teams we know of in the state. Lawrence and Leavenworth were playing each other. Both the white male teams and the African American male teams were playing each other in games at that time. And so there were a lot of African American immigrants that came into the state, partly as a result of the Civil War and then the collapse of Reconstruction. There was the Exodus and the pre-Exodus, the Nicodemus colony up northwest of us that's now a National Historic Site. So there were a lot of African Americans that saw this as a place to kind of escape and start over. And so a lot of communities had African American teams that paralleled the teams of the white males. And we were one of the last states to actually, in professional baseball, minor leagues, they were called minor leagues back then. They weren't quite the same as they are now, but they weren't all affiliated with a major league team. But professional teams were playing in eastern Kansas, as far west as Salina and Wichita even, in the late 1800s. Kansas was one of the last states to have African Americans playing on teams with white players. It started to fade very quickly across the country because they started importing professional players who weren't members of the local community, and so they said, we object, we're not going to play against or with people of color. And so that started to disappear, although we were one of the last ones to have that. We're on the fringe, and so things get here a little slower sometimes. But you look at the town teams, there were still town teams that were oftentimes integrated because everybody knew each other. So they could do that on the baseball field. Everything was segregated in town, but they could play together because you wanted the best players, and it didn't matter whether he was white or African American or what. you wanted to win, you brought in the best player, and that was okay to do on the baseball diamond. So the integration persisted in the town teams well past the time that it was basically forbidden in professional baseball.
It was interesting. Producer Jeff Durall had thrown out a name. He had interviewed an individual who is actually referenced in your book.
Yeah, Eldon Hogsett. He's from Brownell. He's actually buried down there now. Who was, he claimed he was partial Indian, although we don't know that 100% for sure. But basically he looked, he had the darker complexion, the very black hair, and so he was judged as that based on his appearance, whether there was documentation for or not. And that applied to all these players. If they were Spanish, they could play in professional baseball. If they looked like they had some African American blood, they were banned from baseball. And so it was based on appearance, not by any kind of documentation. It was just based on how you looked. And so it was a very different world back then.
But you quoted an interesting statement from him about his pitching ability.
Yeah, he played in the major leagues for a little while. He was a mediocre sort of pitcher. And a couple of authors wrote a book about the worst pitchers in baseball, which you would think is kind of an insult, but he communicated with them by letter. And one of his quotes, to paraphrase it at least, is that he was never made it into the Hall of Fame, but because he was a pitcher in the major leagues, he probably helped some of the other players get there. So, yeah, so he kept it all in perspective. I mean, it was baseball. It was, especially at that time, it was a sport. It was fun. It's become a little bit more of a business now, but you know, you kind of had to have that kind of an attitude, I think.
Part 2, Kansas baseball gets into historic parks, including Rossville, 1924.
1924 wooden grandstand.
And Kinsley, Lawrence Dumont in Wichita, Garden City, Chanute, Larned, Junction City, El Dorado, and in 1940, Larks Park. Let's talk about the history of Larks Park.
Larks Park was the last one of those to be built before World War II. And when I say ballpark, I'm referring not just to the field, but to the grandstand. And so there are some fields that have basically been used since the 1890s. But they, of course, had grandstands were made of wood in the early days, and they burned down or blow down or something, and so they had to periodically be replaced. So I looked for the oldest grandstands where somebody took the time to build something permanent to go along with the baseball
rather than
diamond.
just an open field.
Right, and so, and Hayes was playing in various places. The first games were played out at the old fort in the parade ground. In fact, we're going to do a reenactment. We're going to have a vintage team from Topeka come out and do an 1869 rules baseball game out there in August on the 26th. And so that was the first place because it was a big patch of nice buffalo grass or whatever. It was easy to throw some bases out there and play. The soldiers had been doing it before that. And then there also was one down basically where Lewis Field is, that area now. There was a fairground down there eventually too, but that was one of the other early baseball fields that they had. And the first one on campus was actually what's now the quadrangle behind Picken Hall, was the only building at that time. So they kind of moved the stadium around here and there all over the place, but it always kind of got crowded out. You know, campus is growing, we need that space. And that happened in a lot of towns. The baseball park sometimes got moved a lot. And so finally what Hayes did, with the help of the federal work programs, the WPA in this case, there were some others, finally decided they were going to build one down where it is now, where Larks Park sits, down by the swimming pool and all the other park aspects, you know, the Frontier Park area in town. And so they decided they could go ahead and build one there. And with that federal aid, they were able to build something more permanent than the wooden grandstands they'd had before. And so they made it out of concrete, faced with local limestone. And it still sits down there today. The most interesting thing I learned about that, and I haven't found anything more about this yet, so maybe somebody will know. The first lights, a lot of these grandstands had roofs because you played in the daytime and you needed shelter from the sun. It wasn't to protect you from the rain because you weren't playing baseball in the rain. It was to protect people from the sun. But at that time in 1940, lighted baseball parks were becoming more normal. And so Hayes didn't put a roof on theirs. It cost more money, so they didn't have to spend money on that. And so they were going to put in lights, and they figured they could play a lot of their games in the evening if it was too warm. And the lights, the fixtures, not the poles, but the fixtures that they bought, they purchased from the Kansas City Monarchs. The Kansas City Monarchs had a portable lighting system on trucks that they would go and set up. They had a big generator that sat out behind the center field fence, and they would run those lights up in towns that didn't have baseball lights. And so they did that through the 30s, and that's how they survived the Depression. They could go play a night game when everybody was off work. But then all the ballparks started getting lights. They didn't need those anymore. And so someone in Hayes, I'm not sure who, made the arrangements to buy those light fixtures to install on poles down at Larks Park. And what's happened to those light fixtures, I don't know. I'd like to know, but I don't know.
Maybe if somebody has a clue,
somebody's
let you
storage
know.
shed somewhere, who knows where they are. But I've been around talking to people on campus and at Midwest. Nobody knows what happened to them. So
It's a summer read for you. Kansas Baseball, 1858 to 1941. Written by author, teacher of biology at Fort Hays State, Mark Eberle. Your good summer read. And Mark Eberle, our community connection.
Angels Care Home Health, serving Hays and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
My Angel Care physical therapist taught me how to do exercises safely.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible.
It gives us independence in our home.
Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.